The Polar Express is a 1985 Christmas book written and illustrated by Chris Van Allsburg and later made into a popular children's movie in 2004. If you've ever watched the movie, you may or may not have picked up on some interesting symbolism, which may or may not point to Christian beliefs. Now, don't click that dislike button, I know what you're thinking. Let me be clear that this isn't any sort of preachy video. This channel isn't anything like that. I just found the topic quite fascinating. So stick around, I promise that there's evidence here that goes beyond mere interpretation. But before we get to that, in the spirit of my channel, we should go over the story of the author Chris Van Allsburg. If you're new here, welcome. My channel explores the lives of artists and creators who have helped influence our culture into what it is today. I go over a little bit of everything, there's no real consistency, just whatever I find interesting. But please, after this video, go check out some of my other videos and see if this is the kind of content you'd be interested in subscribing to. Now, I know learning the story of an artist might not be everyone's cup of tea, so if you're here just to hear about the movie, you can skip to this timestamp. But if you're a fan of the movie, maybe you'll join us to learn about the man who gave us all the joy of the Polar Express. Chris Van Allsburg was born to a Dutch family in Grand Rapids, Michigan on June 18, 1949, along with his older sister Karen, born in 1947, and his two parents Doris and Richard Van Allsburg. They lived in an old farmhouse next to a creamery which his family operated, East End Creamery, which was owned by his grandfather Peter Van Allsburg. The family business produced butter, cream, cottage cheese, ice cream, and other milk products. They delivered the creamery's items to people's homes in yellow and blue trucks. Once surrounded by farmland, the creamery soon became surrounded by other houses and buildings by the time Chris was born. After some time, Chris's grandfather Peter retired, after which his father and uncles took over the creamery business. Actually, sometime way later in 1963, Chris's mother Doris opened up her own business, Jersey Junction. At the beginning, they sold ice cream sourced from East End Creamery, with one of their specialties being dill pickle ice cream. East End Creamery eventually closed its doors, but Jersey Junction is still open and a big part of the community. By the time he was 3, Chris and his family moved to another part of Grand Rapids, into a developing neighborhood where there was still plenty of nature. His new home was 1.5 miles of Brenton Downs Elementary School, just close enough for him to walk to every day. He attended this school until the 6th grade when his family moved again to East Grand Rapids, which is east of Grand Rapids. I know, obviously, but it isn't quite part of main Grand Rapids. As a kid, Chris Van Allsburg was not much of a creative. He was interested in art, it was actually his favorite subject growing up, but back then, there was pressure for boys to be athletic. So fearing rejection, he chose not to pursue art. His hobbies were more centered around using his hands to build things like model planes, cars, trains, and more. He said he was oddly craftsmanlike for a child, something that would come in handy for him much later. One small example of this craftsmanship was sculpting this platypus at the age of 7, which was the only time he took art seriously at a young age. It used to have a tail, but it fell into the sink one day and broke off. As far as academics go, Chris was interested in math and science. He attended both junior high and high school in East Grand Rapids. By the time he was finishing classes at East Grand Rapids High School, the time came to think about college. Because many students from his school went on to attend the University of Michigan, admissions officers from the university would come to the school to speak with qualified students about attending U of M. Chris was among the chosen and given a form to fill out while he waited in the counselor's office for his meeting. Chris handed his form to the admissions officer, who pointed out that no major had been elected. He asked Chris what he wanted to study, but he didn't have the faintest idea. He had fleeting thoughts of maybe becoming a lawyer or something, but nothing he was ready to commit to. While scanning the list of colleges offered at the university, he asked about one called forestry. He imagined being able to just plant trees for 4 years in college, which sounded cool, but after it was explained to him, he asked about another called A&D. This was the School of Architecture and Design, which also included the art school. A sudden impulse washed over him. Although Chris had never thought of pursuing art, for whatever reason, he decided right then and there that he was going to become an artist. But there was one glaring issue the U of M officer pointed out. Chris didn't have any art classes in his transcripts. Chris Van Allsburg stated, "I don't exactly know why. There's a point in teenagers' lives sometimes when the temptation of pulling the wool over an adult's eyes is irresistible." The 17-year-old Chris rose to the challenge of deceiving the admissions officer by telling him the reason art wasn't on his transcript was because he was so advanced that he studied privately on weekends instead of at school, elaborating that he paints and does stone carving at his home studio, all while pretending he had more knowledge than he actually did, naming artists like Van Gogh. However, the officer was still not convinced and asked Chris his opinion on Norman Rockwell, an extremely popular commercial artist of the time who painted and illustrated American life. While beloved by most Americans, his art was often critiqued by the art world for his style, his subject matter, and well, basically, his art was looked down as low art. Luckily, Chris knew of Rockwell and assumed the officer was a fan, so he corroborated an answer to appease him. "I believe Norman Rockwell is unfairly criticized for being sentimental. I think he is a wonderful painter who captures America's longings, America's dreams, and presents American life with the drama and sensitivity of a great playwright." The officer pounded the table and shouted, "Boy, you are absolutely right." Before Chris knew it, he was enrolled at the College of Architecture and Design at the University of Michigan. Chris was not at all concerned about what he had just gotten himself into, spending his summer vacation as carefree as ever. But little did he know he was in for a rude awakening. When classes at the university began in the fall of 1967, he quickly felt out of place, completely outmatched by all his peers who actually did study privately. Not only that, but he had to take a lot of art classes, way more than he was anticipating. Not wanting to be the worst student there, he figured he'd try to excel in something other than drawing and painting, which were already dominated by his extremely gifted classmates. Everything changed when he took a three-dimensional design class, which taught him how to build with his hands. Remember, he had built a lot of models in his youth, which was finally coming in handy for him. By his sophomore year, Van Allsburg had taken up sculpture instead. He realized he had a knack for carving wood and produced this narrow 16-inch toilet sculpture made of pine. This set him on a new path, and he gave up drawing since he felt he was no good at it. Several months later, he produced this piece, which is what he thought a car driven by Mickey Mouse would look like. Van Allsburg was into this idea of elevating pop culture to seem prestigious. He thought he was revealing a refinement and beauty which may have gone overlooked since pop culture is the antithesis of prestige. However, he said his professor and class weren't convinced of his idea. But if you fast forward to today, there's artists like Jeff Koons who create these very colorful pop culture sculptures. 4 months later, Van Allsburg created this boat about the ridiculousness of hyperbole, which was still made of wood, but after this he started working with other materials, like these next pieces of a bull terrier and rabbits made of resin. I think his sculptures are great, especially the resin ones. It really elevates this beautiful pop culture aesthetic he was going for. He eventually moved on to tragic narrative pieces instead, adding bronze casting to his skill set. While creating tragedy pieces, he explored architecture as well. I like this one, which is a building he created of a chair factory. His Chrysler building is also interesting, as it's made of a rather unconventional material, leather. Similar to the comedic quality of the chair factory, this is a sculpture of the Flatiron Building in New York. He made this in response to the disappointment of realizing the building was not as flat as it first appeared. No rooms in this building, just hallways. We won't be going over every sculpture he did, but if you're still interested, I'll leave a link in the description to his presentation of all of these. Chris's next fascination was about freezing motion, like this cup of coffee spilling, a sphere shooting through a cone, ball coming to a skidding stop on a checkered carpet, which is the literal name of the piece, and an obelisk being blown by the wind. Van Allsburg stayed at the University of Michigan for 5 years. He purposely stayed back an extra year so he could completely immerse himself in the last 3 or so art classes he still needed to take. He also took this extra time to flesh out his portfolio as he planned on studying for his master's degree. Chris really impressed those around him with his craftsmanship, including a fellow art student named Lisa Morrison, who studied art education. Chris Van Allsburg earned his Bachelor of Fine Arts from the University of Michigan, and he and Lisa fell in love and moved to Rhode Island after graduation in 1972. Lisa became a third-grade art teacher in the Rhode Island area, and Chris went on to study for his Master of Fine Arts at the Rhode Island School of Design. If you're an artist, you may know this school. It's extremely prestigious and infamous for its rather obscene mascot, Scrody. At this new college, Chris furthered his sculpture education. Things were getting serious with his partner Lisa, and Chris converted to her religion of Judaism. I couldn't find out if Chris had any former religious beliefs. From what I personally know, there are a lot of Dutch Reformed Christians in Grand Rapids, so maybe he was one of those, seeing as how he's Dutch. He went on to marry Lisa Morrison in 1974, and the following year, he graduated from the Rhode Island School of Design and rented a cheap studio space to work in. But winter nights became a problem in the studio. The landlord would turn off the heat in the building after 5 p.m., leaving his studio space unbearably cold, to the point where Chris couldn't use his hands to sculpt. Being young and energized, he decided to take advantage of the situation. Instead of sculpting, why not sit and draw? He never got any good at drawing throughout all his years in art school, so this was just as good a time as any. Chris soon began exhibiting and selling his sculptures around New York, like at the Allen Stone Gallery, all while practicing his drawing techniques. His figure drawing and compositions were pretty naive, as he put it, but his sense of tone was strong, which is how light or dark something is. This gave his drawings a moody atmosphere. They also held a bizarre narrative quality to them. While these drawings were just a hobby, his wife Lisa thought they were amazing. Not just her, Chris's art dealer Alan Stone gave him a call one day asking if Chris had any drawings to show a curator from the Whitney Museum of Art in New York, who was looking for young illustrators. Chris reluctantly sent 2 of his amateur works, and the drawings surprisingly made it into an exhibition at the museum in 1978. This gave his wife Lisa an idea. Maybe Chris could be a book illustrator. She brought home a stack of children's books from the school's library to show Chris. Unfortunately, this only led to disappointment. They were uniformly sentimental and condescending stories accompanied by art that was the same, said Chris. The drawings looked like they were made by adults pretending to be children, artificially injecting childlike qualities into their illustrations. Only one book in the pile stood out, Higgledy Piggledy Pop, which Van Allsburg considered to be real illustration. Lisa took her husband's work to several publications, hoping to get him some illustration work, but since most of his portfolio was sculpture, this proved difficult. Until she showed a friend, David Macaulay, who was already a book author and illustrator. David agreed that the drawings would be effective for a book illustration and encouraged her to present the drawings to his editor. So they met with editor Walter Lorraine of the Houghton Mifflin Company in Boston, Massachusetts. To their surprise, the editor loved it and offered Chris some stories to illustrate. However, he was not a fan of any of the kiddie stories. Small rabbits going off to their first day of kindergarten, learning how to share their carrots, etc. Chris just couldn't see himself enjoying illustrating for any of these books. The editor understood, but saw potential in Chris and eventually called back. He told Chris the only way he'd get to do the kinds of illustrations he wanted was to write his own stories. Initially taken aback by the preposterous idea, Chris knew this was indeed the only way. While he'd never written a story before, he persisted. Just like with art school a decade ago, he was going in blind. The way Van Allsburg approached his first book was to think of an image. A scene of a boy chasing a dog through a garden came to mind. This was his starting point. He began to interrogate himself about the image. Questions like, who's the boy? Who's the dog? Whose garden is this? It's like he was discovering the story rather than writing it, peeling back the layers one by one. This eventually led to his first book, The Garden of Abdul Gazazi, in 1979. This is a story about a dog who dashes into a retired magician's garden. The boy runs after him, only for the dog to be turned into a duck by the magician who hates dogs. Van Allsburg thought the book would maybe sell a few copies, and he'd get the remainder back to give as presents to people for the foreseeable future. But once the book was published, Chris's editor started sending over book reviews. The story was being met with high praise from high places, like Time magazine and the New York Times. The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi won numerous awards, including a Caldecott Honor, which celebrates the most distinguished American picture books for children, which is insane considering Van Allsburg had done less than 10 illustrations in his life before drawing for this book. He claims the first drawing inside the book was the 8th or so drawing he ever made. Also, the dog in the book, Fritz, was inspired by his brother-in-law's dog, and became an Easter egg he'd hide in subsequent books. This book has recently caught the attention of Disney, who bought the film rights for it back in 2019, but as of yet, no real news has come of the project. I'm not sure why Disney chose this book, maybe because Van Allsburg's book adaptations have done pretty well in the past, and they figured they tried cashing in on his very first story. Speaking of film adaptations, Chris's next book is one you should all be familiar with, Jumanji. Yes, this is Chris Van Allsburg's second book, and this time it won the Caldecott Medal in 1982. His first book won the Caldecott Honor, which several books get, but only one book a year gets the medal. I didn't get to mention this earlier, but around this time, Chris was teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design. He gave his students an assignment to draw animals in such a way that the viewer was convinced that they were occupying the same space as them. This helped inspire Van Allsburg for this story. Much like Ghazazi, Jumanji started as an image in his head which he asked questions about. What if two bored children discovered a board game? What if the board game came to life? What then? He calls this approach the what if and what then approach. Van Allsburg liked this idea of cognitive dissonance, essentially putting two normal things together in ways they don't quite belong. For example, a home is normal and a rhinoceros is normal, but a rhinoceros in your home is bizarre without context. Chris's drawing technique for this book also changed. For the Garden of Abdul Ghazazi, a very sharp pencil was used to meticulously get the gray tones correct. For Jumanji, Chris realized he could just use charcoal to block in large areas and use his finger and some cloth to blend, and then finish it off by adding highlights with an eraser. This also allowed him to work bigger, which meant higher fidelity illustrations. The general plot of this book is well known thanks to the 1995 film adaptation. Two kids find a board game and soon discover that the game materializes itself in the real world, their house becoming full of animals from the game. On the other hand, the film took a lot of liberties to fill the runtime. One big change was adding Robin Williams' character of Alan Parrish, who becomes the central character, along with a slew of other adults not present in the book. The film almost didn't happen until Chris helped with the script. However, they ended up rewriting whatever he wrote. It was initially more like The Twilight Zone, but was turned into an action movie instead. Van Allsburg didn't hate the movie, but wasn't satisfied with it either. Not to get too ahead, but after the success of Jumanji, the studio was planning a sequel without the help of Van Allsburg. When Chris asked what would stop this terrible idea, they responded, only a better idea, which led to Zathura in 2002 and made into a movie in 2005 by Jon Favreau. While not as popular as Jumanji, it's still a solid spiritual successor. However, the Jumanji movie did spawn a short animated cartoon. And here's the kicker, 2 film sequels decades later. They just couldn't help themselves, could they? I guess they're not technically sequels, as they have almost nothing to do with the original premise and just capitalized off the property. I couldn't find any comment from Van Allsburg about the additional films, but I can't imagine he enjoyed them very much. He was involved with the writing for the 1999 film, but not so much with this new Star Power Hollywood reboot. Fun fact, the word Jumanji means nothing. Chris just needed a cool, exotic sounding name. The same goes for Zathura. Okay, moving on. His next book, Ben's Dream, also experimented with another medium, pen and ink. And the book after that, The Wreck of the Zephyr, he finally started to draw in color and pastel, and then watercolor after that. We won't go over every book, but the point is, in these early days, Chris was exploring all kinds of different techniques since he was still relatively new to illustration. I did, however, want to take the time to tell you about this book, The Mysteries of Harris Burdick. This has one of the most interesting backstories to a book I've ever heard. The beginning of this tale has nothing to do with Chris Van Allsburg, so forget about him for a moment. Rather, a children's book editor from Massachusetts named Peter Wenders is who we'll focus on. Back in 1953, a man introducing himself as Harris Burdick came to Peter's office. Mr. Burdick was there to show Peter his portfolio of 14 drawings. Burdick explained that he had written 14 stories and that these were one drawing from each of those. Peter was interested in the work and told Burdick to bring in the stories as soon as possible. However, that day never came. Harris Burdick never returned and had left his 14 drawings in the possession of Peter Wenders. Fast forward 30 years to 1983, Chris Van Allsburg was doing book signings at a Massachusetts library when a man approached them, whispering that he had something Chris needed to see. The man was Peter Wenders, who showed Chris the drawings of Harris Burdick. Apparently, the art styles of Burdick and Van Allsburg were an exact match. So much so that Peter was convinced Chris was the reincarnation of Burdick, or the two must be related somehow. For years, Peter and his kids had written dozens of their own stories to accompany the mysterious illustrations. Chris and Peter saw the potential of these being turned into a book without a story. You see, Harris Burdick included titles and a small description on each drawing. These would accompany each illustration in the book and made for great story starters, so children could write their own creative stories. There was even an online writing competition for kids back in the day. While the book was published under Chris Van Allsburg's name, these weren't his own drawings. The book states they're reproductions. I'm not sure if that means they were redrawn, but either way, there's still legal issues for doing something like this. So for 7 years, Chris didn't earn any royalties and waited for Harris Burdick or a descendant to claim the images. But no one ever came forward. However, someone named Daniel Hirsch did contact Van Allsburg in 1994, claiming he had another Burdick drawing which went along with one of the other stories titled Missing in Venice. He found it hiding in an old antique mirror from a deceased woman in 1963. Some have called into question this whole Harris Burdick story, but Van Allsburg says it's very true. Just who was Harris Burdick? I guess we'll never know. There was a follow-up book, The Chronicles of Harris Burdick, which included stories from other authors. Also, along with The Garden of Abdul Ghazazi, Disney picked up the film rights for this book as well. The very next story after this was finally The Polar Express, one of Van Allsburg's most beloved books. For The Polar Express, the image he thought of was of a boy seeing a train standing still in front of his house with snow covering the ground. With his trusty what if, what then approach, he asked where the train was going. Well, there's snow on the ground, meaning it's winter. Maybe it's December 24th perhaps. Where would a kid go if he could go anywhere on December 24th? How about north, all the way to the North Pole? Who lives in the North Pole? Santa, of course. But what happens on December 24th in the North Pole? Maybe a ceremony of some kind, a ceremony which requires a child, delivered by a train that would have to be named the Polar Express. As talented of an artist Van Allsburg now was, you'd be surprised to know he actually enjoys the writing parts more than the drawing. The discovery of the story all happens in the writing. The drawing is merely transferring what is in his mind onto the page for the reader to see. He finds that process tedious and wishes a machine could just automatically generate the art for him. Let's hope he never turns to using AI. Van Allsburg tends to write stories that carry a deeper psychological message. He doesn't start with any idea of this message, rather it develops naturally. For The Polar Express, Van Allsburg thought he was just writing about a train trip, but it soon evolved into a story of faith and the desire to believe in something. Van Allsburg says, "The inclination to believe in the fantastic may strike some as a failure in logic, but it's really a gift. A world that might have Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster is clearly superior to one that does not." The book is really about not losing your faith in the fantastic. Don't let the rational thinking you, hopefully, gain as an adult take away your joy of believing. He even used rational thinking to his advantage when writing. In the Polar Express, a boy travels to the North Pole and meets Santa. When thinking of the design for the North Pole, Chris said it would logically have to be full of factories, given all the toys produced each year. Just like with Jumanji 4 years prior, Van Allsburg did it again and won his second Caldecott Medal for the Polar Express in 1986. The book was received very well and has become even more popular since its adaptation for the big screen. But before we get there, here's some fun facts about the book. The train in the story was inspired by a real steam locomotive, the Pierre Marquette 1225. Chris used to play on this locomotive as a child while it was still on display at the Michigan State campus. Even the train number 1225 is the date of Christmas. The train's blueprints were used to model the one in the eventual film, and even the whistle and sound of the steam were faithfully recreated.
I've wanted to do that my whole life!
The neighborhood you see in the book, as little as you can see, was modeled after the East Grand Rapids neighborhood Van Allsburg grew up in. Not only that, but the book partially takes place in Grand Rapids. Same goes for the movie. Initially, Van Allsburg wasn't sure what the boy should choose as the first gift of Christmas, but given that his entire character was centered around believing a bell from Santa's sleigh was the perfect choice. This was Van Allsburg's easiest book to write. He wrote a single draft and made only minor adjustments. He said once he decided where the train was headed, the story just came to him. He said it felt like he was the narrator remembering the story instead of making it up. Remember his friend David Macaulay who set Chris up with his editor? Well, the children in the book were modeled after David's neighbor's kids, and David was the model for Santa. The art of Chris Van Allsburg is very unique. I don't think I've seen anyone draw quite like him. In the case of the Polar Express, he drew with oil pastels and used a lot of complementary hues. There's this softness to his art that is so calming to look at, yet also a bit unsettling. I don't know if it's just me, but these drawings give off a liminal space feel. They feel empty, yet detailed, real, yet idealized, cozy, yet lonely. Chris was inspired by the work of famous German romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich. You're probably familiar with his most famous painting, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which fits with the calming yet lonely feeling. Alright, time to briefly wrap up the rest of his career. As you'd expect, Van Allsburg continued writing and illustrating books. As of today, he's written nearly 20 books and has helped illustrate for other authors, like Mark Halperin on his Swan Lake trilogy series. Chris said he didn't enjoy that experience much since it wasn't his own work. He also feels like he didn't contribute anything given how descriptive Mark Halperin already is in his writing. An illustration would only serve to diminish the imagination of the reader. He also illustrated some covers for the Chronicles of Narnia in the 90s. I'd like to shout out this book, Two Bad Ants, which I had no idea was from Van Allsburg, but I remember it fondly from my childhood. The imagery is fun to look at. It's about two ants who get into one situation after another, and the illustrations are from the ants' perspective. He's had a lot of unique books that I encourage you to take a look at. In between doing all these books, he also practiced still life drawing. And just look at these, it's hard to believe he has no formal drawing education. At least not that I know of. He taught himself in his late 20s and completely leapfrogged his way to being extremely talented. Chris also went on to have two daughters with his wife Lisa, Sophia, born in 1991, and Anna, born in 1995. One of Chris's more recent ventures is creating mezuzahs and more for Lisa's business, Forgotten Judaica. Although Chris converted to Judaism, he still loves Christmas. Lisa does the traditional menorah lighting, but he and his daughters also put up a Christmas tree. Alright, let's finally talk about the Polar Express movie. We won't go over everything, but I do want to take a quick look at the production. It all started when actor Tom Hanks was reading the book to his children. It's a book they loved ever since it was released in 1985. Hanks said the book mystified him. It had a weird, almost haunting feeling to it he couldn't quite put his finger on. He loved the art and the elegant yet sophisticated themes of the story. The author of the book, Chris Van Allsburg, often made his books have some twist or deep message. For the Polar Express, that message was very much one of believing. Tom Hanks really wanted to make a movie based on the book, so he brought the idea to his friend and director, Robert Zemeckis. The two had worked together before for Forrest Gump and Castaway, two very important films for both their careers. Zemeckis also directed classics like Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Contact, and more. Tom Hanks asked Zemeckis if a movie like The Polar Express was even feasible. However, Chris Van Allsburg had no plans to sell the film rights to his book. He knew the awful stuff Hollywood did to pad out the source material. He already experienced that with his second book, Jumanji. However, after realizing Tom Hanks wanted to adapt his book, he quickly changed his mind. We all know how the film eventually looked, but did you know it was originally planned as a live-action movie? Chris Van Allsburg was against the use of CGI since he felt it wouldn't do his characters justice. Director Rob Reiner was set to direct The Polar Express originally. Reiner also has an impressive portfolio, like This Is Spinal Tap, Stand By Me, The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and more. He even had some experience with Tom Hanks acting alongside him in Sleepless in Seattle. And Reiner's production company, Castle Rock, helped with The Green Mile, starring Tom Hanks. It's said the Polar Express production began right after The Green Mile. The film was slated for 2001, but after delays in production, Reiner stepped down, and that's when Robert Zemeckis took over. The film was rewritten to introduce a new cast of characters, most of whom don't have names for whatever reason. Author Chris Van Allsburg was also brought on board and tried helping with the script. One of his ideas was to include a backstory for the conductor, but the producer shut it down because it wasn't in the book, which was a head-scratcher for Chris because how else did they intend to fill the runtime? But as with Jumanji, Van Allsburg knew that once you signed the rights away, you are no longer the captain. Robert Zemeckis planned on doing a film that was faithful to the book, but if you've read the book and watched the movie, you'll know that's not really the case. So how did The Polar Express become CGI if the author was against it? Well, Robert Zemeckis agreed that CGI wasn't the way to go, but did raise concerns over budget and told Van Allsburg that live action wouldn't work well. Zemeckis also loved the painterly illustrations of the book and wanted to keep that feeling intact as much as he could, something that would be lost in live action. Robert Zemeckis and Sony's Imageworks studio explored ideas to marry live action with the painterly quality of the book. One approach was to add image processing to the picture to give it a pastel painted feeling. A computer graphics supervisor named Alberto Minaj suggested motion capture as a possibility, which is where actors wear a special suit and face markers to digitally capture their motions. Alberto had worked on movies like Spider-Man and had extensive knowledge on utilizing motion capture, even writing a book on it. His suggestion was met with skepticism since motion capture had never been used for an entire feature film, but the team was desperate for ideas and didn't want to rule out the possibility. It was a difficult process, and a lot of work and innovations had to be made along the way, but motion capture ultimately won out. While you could still consider it CGI, it had the human aspect to it, with the motion captured performances and very human-like faces, something that has unsettled countless viewers for just how creepy and unnatural characters appear. But I will say, I think it works. It matches the very real-looking art style found in the book. One huge selling point of this technology was that any actor could play any role, to which they used greatly to their advantage. Tom Hanks initially only playing the conductor, but now he could be anybody. He ended up performing the motion capture roles of the hero boy, the father, the conductor, the hobo, and Santa. He also voiced most of those motion capture roles, plus a couple others like the narrator and Scrooge. Tom really loved this form of acting. He said it felt liberating to him, like rehearsing a play in the round. He didn't have to worry about lighting, camera angles, none of that. He was just on stage, essentially acting a series of 15-minute short plays in real time. The Polar Express became the very first feature film to be fully shot using motion capture, but some stuff did still need to be animated by hand, like the eyes and eyebrows, even though they had over 150 markers on their faces. Along with getting the look right, the feel and message was also important. The book starts with a boy lying awake on Christmas Eve listening for Santa's sleigh. A train takes him to the North Pole where he meets Santa, and the book ends with a touching message about believing. And the original story is about as simple as that. However, Robert Zemeckis drowned his version of the story with faith. There's so much talk of faith, you might just take a trip to the North Pole yourself, expecting to meet Santa. One promotional tagline for the film was, "This holiday season, believe." And what is Christmas truly about believing in? I think it was inevitable for Robert Zemeckis to turn to Christian sensibilities to achieve this message of faith. Now, the film can be interpreted any way you like, but there's definitely intention behind the themes of the film. Again, this is purely for entertainment, so let's dive into some Christian interpretations of the film, mostly from this article written by Jonathan Di Benedetto, who did a great job of connecting the film to biblical teachings. But if that doesn't float your boat, afterwards we'll look at some more convincing evidence. The very first scene establishes our main character, also known as Hero Boy, as someone who denies Santa's existence and tries to convert his sister to that same belief. This is already a conscious departure from the book. In the original story, he wants to believe, but is told by a friend that Santa doesn't exist. But here, he's already a non-believer. The movie even takes it a step further, showing us his research. Obviously, Santa can be seen as a godlike figure, all-knowing, judges the actions of people, writes your name down on a list, like God's Book of Life. So the hero boy's disbelief in Santa is an obvious parallel to people's disbelief in God. That's obvious, but here's where things get more interesting. Let's go over the other characters and who they represent. The train conductor leads our hero boy on the path of renewed faith and salvation. The conductor can be seen as Jesus. Oh, and guess what? His train also has symbolism. The train is the church. The church is literally the vehicle to salvation. It takes us on that path. The conductor invites people on board, but each person has the free will to come to Christ or not, as we see with the young boy Billy, who initially declines. And although he may be a doubter, the grace of the conductor invites the hero boy anyway, indiscriminately. The mysterious hobo ghost is a little more interesting. He doesn't exist in the book, and we never learn much about him. Why is that? If you ask the average person, they can tell you who God and Jesus are. But there is a third entity that people may know little about: the Holy Spirit. This is who the hobo is meant to portray. He is an intentional addition to the story to complete the Holy Trinity, all of whom are unified by the same actor, Tom Hanks. At first, he appears sinister, mocking Santa and claiming himself the king of the North Pole. This odd introduction leads audiences to believe he may be the devil. But he is bound to the church, or train, and his actions are always for the benefit of the characters. He wants the hero boy to see Santa and believe in him. From what I read on the Holy Spirit, it causes people to recognize the error of their ways so that they may repent. This may explain the hobo's actions. He wasn't mocking Santa, rather mocking the hero boy so he realizes how he must sound for being a doubter. Also, the hobo does everything in his power to bring the kid back on board the train, or church, which is exactly what the Holy Spirit is meant to do. Just like the conductor's anecdote of an unseen force saving him from falling off the train, which is then followed by, sometimes seeing is believing, but sometimes the most real things in the world are the things we can't see. This is very much like when Jesus said, "Blessed are they who did not see and yet believed." One of the conductor's jobs is to check for tickets. As we see, these tickets were never physically given to the children, they just manifest themselves, which is important. And I know I sound like a broken record, but this is exclusive to the film. I'm just trying to make a point that the directors were purposely adding in all these elements. The conductor punches letters into these tickets, which doesn't quite make sense to the children yet. Throughout the course of the story, our main cast of characters go through trials and tribulations, which causes them to grow stronger in areas they thought they were weak in before. One of the last scenes in the movie reveals the rest of the letters, each character getting a different word. There's this Christian belief about spiritual gifts, which says all people have a latent ability inside of them, which they later discover and hopefully use to serve the church and God. So for instance, the hero girl is very doubtful of herself throughout the movie, but finally has a triumphant moment where she stands up and leads. She later gets lead punched into her ticket. Something noteworthy said earlier is that tickets are not transferable, which can be taken literally or spiritually, meaning your gift is your own. Speaking of the children, let's go over how they relate to the Bible. The hero boy can be seen as the Apostle Peter. This could be a stretch, but there are some similarities. One correlation, or should I say 3 correlations, is the amount of times hero boy has doubts. Apostle Peter denies Jesus 3 times after Jesus is arrested. He also tells Jesus he loves him 3 times after he is risen, after which Jesus forgives him and appoints him as an apostle once more. Throughout the Polar Express, the hero boy asks, "Are you sure?" 3 times.
Are you sure? This was the break. Are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure?
And 3 times the hero boy proclaims to believe in Santa, just how Peter tells Jesus he loves him 3 times. After which, the boy is forgiven by Santa and appoints him as the child to receive the first gift of Christmas. The hero girl can be seen as Mary Magdalene, who was a passionate leader and who stood by Jesus' side for crucial moments like his crucifixion and resurrection. She was actually the first person Jesus presented himself to when he rose from the dead. The important thing here is the rapport she has with the conductor, who is Jesus. Out of the 4 kids, she connects the most with the conductor and is given the best spiritual gift of leader. In case you're curious, I'll throw the others on screen, but in my opinion, they're just character archetypes with vague biblical similarities. There's also scenes in the movie that have Christian imagery, the most obvious being this parting of the Red Sea, but with caribou. There's also this scene where the train plummets into a scary, fiery face. This can be interpreted as the hobo giving the hero boy a glimpse of hell. There's 3 back-to-back trials which try to prevent the train from reaching the North Pole: the caribou, the glacier gulch, and the frozen lake. But after our characters overcome those, we get a beautiful triumphant scene of ascension. These might be interpreted as the 3 days Jesus was dead and then resurrected. The final act of the film has a lot of symbolism, which is what made me interested in making this video. To start with, in the movie, the North Pole's town square looks an awful lot like St. Peter's Square in the Vatican. In the book, this is probably the best shot we have of the square, and it looks nothing like that. Everyone gathers here, with Santa's reindeer getting adorned with bells that the hero boy can't hear. Now, there is mention in the Bible of trumpets that will sound when Christ returns. One popular theory is that these trumpets will not be heard by the non-believers. Only Christians will hear this trumpet, signifying their salvation. Being a non-believer, the boy can't hear the sound, not until he has a come to Jesus moment and accepts God, or Santa. Not to mention the long trumpets used to introduce Santa, which look an awful lot like the ones angels are always shown using. Before accepting Christ, the boy tries getting a look at the man himself, but the light is obscuring Santa from the boy's vision. In heaven, it is said you'll be able to see God's face now that you're free of sin, but a sinful human will never have that pleasure. At least this is how I saw this whole sequence with my limited grasp of the Bible. Please feel free to add your own theories or corrections in the comments. Okay, let's move on from interpretation and dive into the marketing of the movie. IMBD lists 3 people in charge of marketing, and all 3 have something in common. They all had recently been involved with the marketing for the Passion of the Christ. Specifically, I want to focus on this man, Paul Lauer. He and his company, Motive Entertainment, were in charge of marketing the Polar Express. If you go to their website, you'll see they primarily work on faith-based films, like The Passion of the Christ, The Chronicles of Narnia, the Bible TV series, Son of God, Heaven is for Real, The Shack, Just Mercy, and more. According to the website, Motive Entertainment helped market 6 out of the 10 highest-grossing faith-based films. It doesn't just end there. There was an entire Polar Express marketing campaign spearheaded by Motive Entertainment, which targeted churches. The website is obviously no longer active, but if you poke around at some snapshots, you'll see they had endorsements from pastors and preachers, and all kinds of Christian resources to download. I'm not so sure what this website was. It's called polarexpressdownloads.com. I assumed you could reach the site through the official Polar Express website, but I couldn't find any way to do that. The only mention of anything religious on the official site was this mention of bringing a youth group to watch the film. This campaign was in collaboration with Homeward, a family-oriented Christian nonprofit organization. There's a button leading to that website here, which has even more biblical resources for the Polar Express. There's so many teachings and articles for parents and children, teaching them about the Bible and the true meaning of Christmas through the Polar Express movie. Some of the teachings even line up with the ones we discussed earlier. This same organization also helped a year later with the Chronicles of Narnia, which was also marketed to churches. You can actually see the Motive Entertainment branding throughout these Narnia Christian activity books. Unfortunately, as for the Polar Express resources, we can't see most of them. Some were available through purchase only, like this DVD they sent to 50,000 churches and had interviews with Tom Hanks and Robert Zemeckis. I did read an article outlining the DVD, and it said that neither Hanks nor Zemeckis said anything religious. But there were teachings from Max Lucado, a Christian author and minister. I'd be interested to see this DVD, but it's nowhere to be found online. The Polar Express author Chris Van Allsburg said he had no idea they were going to market the movie to Christians. It came as a surprise even to him. Homeward also broadcast several radio shows promoting the film, with endorsements from popular Christian music artists like Amy Grant, Avalon, and Stephen Curtis Chapman. So why was all this done? I find the circumstances quite strange. We have a comment from the Polar Express writer William Broyles stating, "We were very determined not to make the movie sectarian or of any particular religious faith in any way. But when Paul Lauer of Motive Entertainment asked Zemeckis of the biblical parallels, he winked and said, 'Nothing in a movie this big ends up in the script by accident.' I'm not sure who chose the marketing team. I believe the film's producers make that decision, but why Motive Entertainment? They had just marketed The Passion of the Christ, one of the highest grossing movies of that year, and the highest grossing R-rated film at that time. Maybe they were chosen based on their merits, or Robert Zemeckis was creating an honest-to-God religious children's movie. However, all this discussion can be put to rest if we just investigate Robert Zemeckis himself. In 1997, he said, "I was raised a Catholic on the south side of Chicago, and I felt I had to undo a lot of serious damage. But as I was getting older, I began coming off my absolutely young, arrogant, agnostic beliefs. I was thinking more about coming to terms with human spirituality, but without the judgments and indoctrination that came with being in the church. I've come to peace with it, and it's no longer a demon in my life." He said this during an interview for his movie Contact, a science fiction movie with an emphasis on believing in God. And Robert's next movie after The Polar Express was Beowulf, a film with a lot of Christianity, even though it was not as prevalent in the original source material. Zemeckis has made several movies since The Polar Express, which haven't shied away from throwing in some mention of God or religion. So I think this puts the nail in the cross. I do in fact believe the Polar Express was purposefully injected with subtle nods to Christianity, like faith and angels. However, don't let my opinion change your enjoyment of the film, as the real answer is probably a bit more nuanced. It's simply a movie about believing. Believe in God, believe in Santa, or believe in the goodness of others. No matter how you interpret it, the film just asks that you believe. Thank you for watching. I hope the reception to this one is positive. I had plenty of doubts if this was something I wanted to cover, but it's a video I've wanted to make even before I started my channel. I thought it would be cool to give people a different perspective on the film. I planned this video to release before Christmas, but couldn't meet that deadline thanks to work, and mostly because I spent time doing a 12 Days of Christmas series on my channel. Please check those out if you haven't. I know Christmas was last month, but technically, if you watched the first video, I'm still on time since Christmas celebrations end on January 5th or 6th. Also, it was just the 20th anniversary of this movie in November 2024. And I don't know if you heard, but they're making a Polar Express sequel, which is exciting since this is one of my favorites. But I wonder if that one will have any religious symbolism behind it. Anyway, I hope you all had a wonderful holiday season, and I'm looking forward to another great year with you guys. Remember to stay cultured, and I'll see you all next time.